Welcome back. We're going to pick up with our third video of the series on this introduction to the Hebrew Bible. So we were talking about in the previous presentation the Adam and Eve story. And with that in mind, as we get into this slide here, we've got a couple of passages from that story. And I wanted to use these two passages as an example of something that we were talking about earlier when we started talking about this particular unit in the Hebrew Bible and why we study the Bible as mythology and how the Bible works as mythology. Keep in mind, what we said, one of the purposes that myth serves is that it helps a culture to understand why things are the way that they are. People are very curious. People always ask those why questions, and sometimes the stories of myth are designed to provide answers or to provide explanations in a way that would make sense to people. So here you can see in the Hebrew Bible, in these two separate examples, they're attempting to rationalize or answer some very basic human questions. Let's take, for example, the one on the left. Cursed be you of all cattle and beasts in the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust shall you eat all the days of your life. Enmity will I set between you and the woman, between your seed and hers. He will boot your head, and you will bite his heel. Now, the story tells us that the Satan, or Satan, did not simply show himself or his real form to Eve. Instead, he took on a disguise, and that disguise was one of God's creatures, which was the serpent, who was not, as God created the serpent, an evil being unto itself. That just happened to be the beast that the devil chose when he decided to put on a disguise. He could have just as easily picked any other animal, but I guess the snake was handy. Maybe had the bad luck to be the closest animal around, and that was the disguise that the devil took. So this passage is really addressing that question of why, of all the creatures of the world, why does the snake have no legs? Why does the snake crawl on its belly? This attempts to explain that natural phenomenon by explaining it as a curse that God put on the snake for its role in the fall of mankind. Now, it doesn't mean you have to believe it. It's just that that's a way of explaining things, which again is one of the purposes of the stories of mythology. And then take this one on the right, which is a passage that's been very abused throughout the years, and I think you'll see why. I will terribly sharpen your birth pains. In pain shall you bear children, and for your man shall be your longing, and he shall rule over you. This was designed as punishment to females because of Eve's role in the fall of humankind. Because supposedly she was the one that Satan approached first. She was the one who convinced Adam to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so because of this, the Bible tells us that a curse is placed on the female gender. The female will have to be the one to bear children and to bear the pains of childbirth. Females are the dominion of mankind, who the scripture teaches has the right to rule over her. This biblical passage was used to justify the oppression of women, for centuries. You think about, it was only a little over 100 years ago that women acquired the right to vote. We were not even recognized as citizens, or at least we were not recognized as full citizens. We weren't even recognized as half the human race for many, many centuries. And again, a lot of that justification goes back to the biblical passages. Right or wrong, right? But it's explaining why things are the way that they are. All right, it's being a little slow to switch up here. After the story of Adam and Eve, we know that they go on, after they're cast out of the Garden of Eden, they have to go forth and make their own way. They do raise a family. They eventually have 2 sons, Cain and Abel. And the Bible teaches us that this is our first murder, which is a case of fratricide, brother killing brother. The source of their rivalry really goes back to the fact that from the time that they're born, Cain and Abel are pitted against each other. This is a classic case of sibling rivalry, because Abel is Adam and Eve's favorite son. And he is the chosen one of God. He's God's favorite as well. So it's one of those things where Abel is the golden child and he can do no wrong because he's very obedient and he doesn't question things. Now, on the other hand, we see that Cain is, according to the biblical scripture, we would not interpret Cain as a bad boy necessarily. He's just very inquisitive. He demands answers for things. Why do we have to do such and such? Why do we have to pray to a God that we can't see? Why do we have to sacrifice our lambs for blood? So as the boys grow, Abel becomes a shepherd, and he's responsible for the lambs, which also means he has a ready supply of blood for God whenever God comes calling for sacrifice. Cain, on the other hand, becomes a farmer. He becomes a bearer of fruit. The problem is, this is not what appeases God. And that creates conflict between the 2 brothers. Okay, so, of course, what eventually comes of that is there comes a time when God demands a blood sacrifice, and Abel, of course, is able to offer up a lamb. And Cain offers up one of his melons, the scripture tells us. And this does not please God at all. God takes that as an insult. And, basically is, how dare you, Cain, insult me with this offering? Cain doesn't, he can't get his hands around what he's done wrong. But what happens is God scolds him while praising Abel's sacrifice. And so Cain demands a showdown with his brother Abel. And this is what leads to the conflict that results in the killing of Abel. All right, so I'm going to pause my recording right here, and I'm going to pick up the rest of that story in the next video. All right, so please hang on and join me there.